Hi guys, and welcome back to the second video of the Ucat series. Today we're covering the decision making section and everything you need to know so you can get a solid score. So here's some background information. Decision making is the second section of the Ucat and it consists of 29 questions that need to be answered in 31 minutes. In terms of the marks, 5 questions correct is worth 2 marks, 4 questions correct is worth 1 mark, and 3 or fewer questions correct is worth no marks. So you need to basically try your best. Now, there are different types of questions that can come up, so let's delve into them. So the first is syllogisms, weird name. Now this is when you're given facts and 5 statements and you need to determine whether the statements are true or not. Sometimes more than one statement can be true, so bear that in mind. Now the 5 statements can either be repeating whatever the facts are in the passage, in which they're obviously correct. They can also be hypothetical, so the statement is based on inference but with extra information from outside the text. The third type is that they may not have enough information, so parts of the answer may be true, but other parts may be exaggerated or changed, in which the answer is obviously no. They can also be based on inference, so that the statement has information which must be true based on the text. Now, there are a few general tips which are worth knowing. The first is don't make assumptions. Just don't. For example, just because Chunks missed a penalty doesn't mean that he can't be a penalty coach, so only pick a conclusion if it's been explicitly mentioned in the text. I know that's a wordful, but trust me on this. The next tip is to look out for qualifiers. For example, if the text says that an event is likely, but the statement says must, then you have to select the option no. Now this is followed by my second tip, which is to not skim read. Again, you can't know that people try this, and they will try to confuse you with synonyms which basically waste your time. So now that we've covered syllogisms, let's move on to the next type of question. Now the second type that you can come across are logical puzzles, where you will generally have to interpret information through either diagrams, graphs, or just text, and you need to find a conclusion that goes along with it. Now there are a few things that you must be doing. The first thing is immediately eliminating answers which are clearly untrue. This will save you crucial seconds, which can build up in the Ucat. The second is to look for definitive statements such as must, should, always, as those words can confirm whether the conclusion is true or false. This is something that you'll get better at with more practice. Now the third tip applies to questions with numbers involved. If you come across this, then don't be afraid to round numbers, since you can calculate the closest answer more easily and quickly. Now the final tip for this kind of question is shape algebra. When you come across this, put each shape as a letter. So for example, circle is C, rectangle is R, etc. And then try to rearrange and substitute the equations into one another to find the answer. The fourth tip is to look at the entire statement. It may only be partially true, and this is something which catches people out more than you think. It's also worth knowing that correlation doesn't mean causation. So if two variables on a graph correlate, it doesn't mean that one variable caused the other to occur. Now the next tip is to look out for generalization. For example, if a graph shows you the sales of 2 different drinks in 2019, and the statement says that the first has been sold the least, that statement may be true for that specific year in 2019, but it may not apply to previous years. So in this example, notice how the statement has generalized with the word always. Now let's move on to the third type of question, which are assumptions. For these ones, you have to evaluate whether or not an argument supports a solution to a problem and be able to identify the strongest one. For these kind of questions, always remember to keep an open mind and avoid bias, since that will prevent you from subconsciously being biased. Basically, don't be biased when you're thinking about the question. Yeah, just don't do it. So you might be thinking, well, I can tell the difference between an argument which is for or against a statement, but how can I tell the difference between a strong and a weak argument? Well, believe it or not, it's actually quite straightforward. Strong arguments will always be backed up by evidence, such as facts, statistics, whereas weak arguments would typically be opinionated and based on the writer's emotions. So there's literally zero substance, and it's quite easy to tell the difference between a weak and a strong argument. You should also be able to spot opinions as soon as possible when reading. So for example, if the writer says something like, "It's the responsibility of Matt Hancock to follow his social distancing rules," which he failed quite miserably. But that's known as an opinionated response. Another thing to note with assumptions is that a higher average or higher availability of something doesn't always mean that that something is better. For example, if the average salary is 10% higher in London than Bristol, that doesn't mean that your salary will be exactly 10% higher if you move to London. Realistically, it could be even lower, as well as other factors such as travelling costs, etc. Bear in mind that there won't always be perfect arguments, you'll only have to pick the strongest one. Okay, so let's go through the fourth type of question, which are Venn diagrams. Now, this type is slightly unusual since there will be two types of questions which you will be asked. The first is when you're given data and you need to select the Venn diagram which supports that data. The second type of question is when you're given a Venn diagram and you're asked which conclusion will follow that statement. Now, a general tip to know for this is that you won't need all of the data in the question. So don't do working out if you don't have to. You'll only end up wasting time. I know it sounds harsh, but it's got to be said. The second tip is to always read the question first. This is because you'll know what to do whenever you look at the diagram and you'll feel less overwhelmed. Okay, so let's go through the final type of question in decision making, which is probability. For this kind of question, you will be given a short passage containing statistics and you have to select the most suitable answer. This type of question contains decimals, percentages, etc. So make sure that you're comfortable with these topics before you start doing questions on them. For questions where you have marbles coming out of a bag, watch out to see whether the marbles actually return to the bag or not, since that affects future probabilities. It's also crucial to look out for probabilities that depend on other probabilities, since not all of them depend on previous events, such as a fair coin. That's never going to depend on what's happened before. So let's now move on to my master advice. The whiteboard is your best friend, so use it. This is crucial when you're trying to visualize information. I use this myself and it reduces your cognitive load, which is basically the amount of information that your memory can hold. This way, you're not putting as much pressure on yourself. The second tip is when looking at evidence, it's generally better to consider correlation-based arguments than causation-based, since correlation can show a valid link between two variables, but causation can often be based on assumptions which are completely false, and that basically makes the argument completely invalid. The next tip for this question is to prioritize. Literally, just prioritize. It's not that hard. The reason as to why I'm saying this is because syllogisms have the most time-consuming questions. Yet people still spend too much time on them, making it harder to finish other questions on time. In terms of which questions to prioritize, I would start off with Venn diagrams since they take the least amount of time, followed by the questions with evaluations, then argument questions, then graphs, and finally syllogisms. Now, this is the order in which I prioritize my questions, but bear in mind that this can vary for you. The next master tip is to use keyboard shortcuts. Now, I know that I've already mentioned this in the VR video, but for this section, you will have to use the calculator quite a lot, other than QR, which you have to rinse the calculator. The keyboard shortcut for this is Alt plus C simultaneously, and you use the same shortcut if you want to take it off screen. Now guys, that is the end of the video. I hope this was useful to you. If it was, then feel free to like and subscribe to keep up to date with the rest of the Ucat series. Formal dressing, that's what we do, because we take it seriously around here. I'm out. Peace.